Well, hello everyone. I hope you are having a good morning. Undoubtedly, I'm imagining that you saw my email, and yeah, since I had COVID, every once in a while I have these sort of paralyzing muscle things that happen. But I'm got a heating pad, hopefully trying to remedy this. But unfortunately, I will not be able to really move much or make it up to the classroom. But I did want to at least go over some of the readings a little bit from last week, just to kind of finish up there. And then you'll see in the modules there's a link to a documentary about the Transcendentalists. I think it's a very good one. It talks about Thoreau quite a bit, but it also talks about Emerson, Margaret Fuller, who, early feminist, went to Concord like a lot of them, and really I think does a good job of contextualizing transcendentalism. Just read a very interesting article about transcendentalism and how it could be a model in these post-liberal times, which is a word that seems to be gaining in popularity. When they say post-liberal times, they don't mean that liberal ideals are going to go away, or that we've reached the end of liberalism and there's nothing but conservatism or something like that, but rather recognizing that really for the last 100 years or so, liberalism at large has been the dominant sort of ideology or a way of understanding the world. Has been the dominant sort of political system, liberal democracy. And here, when I say liberalism, I don't mean just sort of, we usually think of like MSNBC, Democratic Party liberals in America, but the much broader philosophy of liberalism, which actually encompasses a lot of things that people might consider conservative, like, the free market, for example. The free market is an idea that goes back to classical liberalism, which is this sort of ideology that emerges in the 1800s that is challenging the traditional orders at the time, which were monarchies and autocracies and things like that. And so classical liberalism becomes this ideology that emphasizes things like science, philosophy, the ancient Greek philosophy, agnosticism or atheism, or just, if not completely challenging religion, and super, ideas that may be regarded as superstitious, at least, not believing them in such a sort of dogmatic and rigid way as was the case before. And so transcendentalism, in its original formulation, is kind of goes along. It sort of develops at about the same time as we would consider classical liberalism developing, and has a lot of the same ideas, an emphasis on self-reliance and emphasis on individualism. It's religious, but not in a sort of dogmatic way. Ralph Waldo Emerson and others argue that, rather than there being some God in heaven or something like this, that God or the Spirit is suffused in all of nature. And, we've talked about that a bit. So I read this interesting article in the academic journal Telos, which is kind of a philosophical journal that kind of talks about topical things. And they were referring to the Scottish writer, bad hair day, referring to the Scottish writer Thomas Carlyle, who, in some ways, very brilliant, interesting thinker, other ways very regressive. kind of authoritarian in some ways, supported slavery, talking about the 1830s, 1840s when he was writing. But nonetheless, he had a lot of these transcendental ideas and actually had a huge influence on people like Thoreau and Emerson, who, kind of drop his more authoritarian attitudes. And, Thoreau was very opposed to slavery, for example, and then kind of carried on. But anyway, this article was arguing that we are sort of heading into these post-liberal times where it's not quite clear what that means, but we do know that, in many democracies around the world, we see parties being supported that are more traditional, more conservative, right-wing, nationalist, all these things that we generally consider liberals not to be. But also we see the rise of more sort of radical, in some ways rigid left-wing movements as well, and some of these can be anti-liberal or illiberal as well. But anyway, this article was kind of making the argument that it's hard to say what would come after liberalism or capitalism or things like this, but it was saying like, well, maybe we can find an answer in transcendentalism, and maybe we need to, kind of reevaluate, these ideas, because they say something about community, about the meaning of life, and so on. I don't know if you've met our teaching assistant for this class. This is Willow, the one-eyed cat who is not feeling very cooperative right now. She's not wanting to work at the moment, apparently. Willie, you're on camera. Hi, Willow. So anyway, she's a bit of a transcendentalist as well. Get her more on camera. Whatever, she'll hang out behind me. So anyway, I thought that was very interesting. Something to think about as we think about new political ideologies and philosophies. So as I said, I just want to kind of briefly go over a few things that maybe didn't get to last time. So we talked about the different sounds, and I do have a few animal sounds I still want to play on Wednesday. But after he talks about sounds, he talks about solitude, and solitude is obviously something that's very key to Walden, because even though he's not necessarily far off in the woods or something like this, he's alone, and in order to live the way that he is living, one has to appreciate solitude and perhaps even enjoy it. And he kind of makes the argument that that solitude is not necessarily a bad thing. On the second page where he's talking about solitude, he says, "My nearest neighbor is a mile distant, and no house is visible from any place but the hilltops within a mile of my own. At night there was never a traveler passed my house or knocked at my door more than if I were the first or last man, unless it were in the spring, when at long intervals some came from the village to fish for pouts. They plainly fished much more in Walden Pond than of their own natures, and baited their hooks with darkness." And then he goes on to say, "I believe that that men are generally a little afraid of the dark, though the witches are all hung in Christianity and candles have been introduced." Again, some of his sort of biting sarcasm, he doesn't really believe in witches. He's kind of showing, he's just kind of pointing out how maybe it's not rational to be afraid of the dark, other than you can't see and might trip and fall or something like that. Don't worry, witches aren't going to get you. We killed all of them, and Christianity is here, and now we have candles too. So But he goes on to say, yet I experience something that the most sweet and tender, the most innocent and encouraging society may be found in any natural object, even the poor misanthrope and the most melancholy man. There can be no very black melancholy to him who lives in the midst of nature and has his senses still. So, he's saying something that, a lot of modern psychologists have taken decades to sort of figure out and integrate into their own understanding and practices, and that's that nature has this positive effect. There's been lots of studies now that show this. I mean, one of the classic ones, showing a couple of groups of people who, some of them go out on this nature walk and others don't. They sit inside or whatever. And then they come back and then they have to take this cognitive test or something, and they find that those who went on the nature walk scored better overall. And as I said, they've done lots of studies like that replicating it. So if you've got a lot of studying to do, exams and so on and so forth, and it might seem like you don't have time to go and look at the ocean or something like this, or stare at the ground or whatever, or just go for a little walk. Again, the research would suggest that actually that's probably the best thing for you, because it will sort of get your mind moving in a different way. And so you can return to the, organic chem exam or whatever it is that you have, and then everything will fall into place and you'll ace the exam. Is what might happen. You probably will have to do some studying too, along with going for a little walk. And he talks about how he's not really one who's bothered by being alone. He says, I've never felt lonesome or in the least oppressed by a sense of solitude, but once that I was a few weeks after I came to the woods, when for an hour I doubted if the near neighborhood of man was not essential to a serene and healthy life. Well, the fact of the matter is that we are social organisms, and we do actually require some, some social interaction. Again, he wasn't in complete solitude. He had plenty of people to talk to here and there. And he probably had the balance a bit right, having, spending a fair amount of time in solitude in nature, and then sometime talking with people as well. Now, not everyone can do that, but, if you're able to, that's probably a good thing. And there are serious questions then about urban areas. I teach urban sociology, and I'm considered an urban sociologist. And one of the things then is, well, what do people in the city do? What do people in, say, LA do? Well, probably leave parts of LA, go to the beach or something like this. Or just, find places where you do have some greenery or some nature if you can find it, and, spend some time there. Remember a few years ago, or 10, 15 years ago, LA was talking about planting all these trees, and I remember thinking, like, well, Willow, my cat's meowing. Willie, come here. Willie. Come here. Silly. Willow, come here. Okay. Los Angeles planned to plant a lot of trees to have more nature and for, carbon dioxide and so on. And I remember thinking, that's a great idea, except, this is Los Angeles, and, this isn't exactly a place where you're going to have forests. So anyway, I think that idea is probably completely abandoned at this point, but to some extent that shows some of the problems with people in cities who may not know the ecology of their own area. And he does, kind of point out that obviously we are, as I said, social organisms. He says we are the subjects of an experiment which is not a little interesting to me. Can we not do without society of our gossips a little while under these circumstances? have our own thoughts to cheer us. Confucius says, truly, virtue does not remain as an abandoned orphan. It must of necessity have neighbors. Meaning that, we should, instead of perhaps following the latest ridiculous nonsense that has come out of Kanye West's mouth, Ye West, whatever that guy's name is now, maybe instead of following him or the Kardashians or all these different people, or even just the gossip of your own friends and so on, that maybe it might actually help you more to spend some of that time just in your own mind, in your own thoughts. He says, I find it wholesome to be alone the greater part of the time. To be in company, even with the best, is soon wearisome and dissipating. I love to be alone. I never found the companion that was so companionable as solitude. We are for the most part more lonely when we go abroad among men than when we stay in our own chambers. A man thinking or working is always alone, let him be where he will. Solitude is not measured by the miles of space that intervene between a man and his fellows. So, again, hello. So, now you can probably, if Thoreau were to take a personality test of a feeling, he would probably score as an introvert. Usually it's people who are introverted who are more inclined to enjoy solitude. And then there are some people who really cannot handle solitude, who really, need to be around other people and thrive and are at their best when there are others. So again, I think this is an example of Thoreau kind of idealizing himself. And however, I will say that I do think, we should, just as people who are introverts, need to spend time in society, and as much as they may dislike it, it's good for them to be involved in social interaction and so on. Similarly, for those who are very gregarious and outgoing and, thrive around other people, it's probably good for them to spend some time alone in their own thoughts and in their own mind. He goes on to say at one point, I am no more lonely than the loon in the pond that laughs so loud, or than Walden Pond itself. Later on in the paragraph, he says, God is alone, but the devil, he is far from being alone. He sees a great deal of company. He is legion. I'm not quite sure exactly his theological point. I think he's just more kind of, making the point that, that it's good to be alone, and if you're not alone, you're evil. No, that's not what he's saying. He's just more making the point that there's nothing wrong with being alone, with having solitude, with enjoying solitude. In the chapter on visitors, he's still kind of caught up in solitude. He says, I had withdrawn so far within the great ocean of solitude, into which the rivers of society empty, that for the most part, so far as my knees were concerned, only the finest sediment was deposited around me. Besides, there wafted to me evidences of unexplored and uncultivated continents on the other side. I love his way of writing. He talks about the great ocean of solitude, which is very individual. He's talking about his own individual experience, but he says, this ocean of solitude into which the rivers of society empty. Meaning that he's not, completely just this atomized being, that his solitude is basically, I'll just use myself as an example. When I find myself in moments of solitude, it's not like I'm detached from the rest of the world, from the rest of society. In fact, often, what I'm thinking about and what I'm pondering are, things that society is, if not society directly, I'm thinking about things that society has instilled in me as a person who has grown up in these things. In in society and being socialized and so on and so forth. And so I think, let's see, and then the readings for this week start with the bean field, and get into that in more detail on Wednesday. In the bean field, he kind of goes into more detail about gardening and his experience with a garden and gardening. And I think we can. We don't have a lot of readings for this week. We're only reading 30 pages. So, compared to the 60 pages from Walden we were reading last week. So I think that will give us, we'll be able to discuss it with no problem on Wednesday. Okay, so that's it as far as my lecture. As I said, the documentary on the Transcendentalists is in the modules as well. Have a good day, and I will see you on Wednesday.